Okay.
Okay.
Hang on, just hang on a sec. Okay.
All right. Loving Father in heaven, Father, we thank you for the opportunity we have to open your word, to join together before you, to learn the lessons that you would have us learn for this time in Earth's history. Help us now, Father, and guide us. Direct our minds, direct our thoughts, direct our conversation, so that which we do will help us to learn of you and help us so that we may more properly represent you in all that we are to do. Be with us now. May your angels attend us so that our focus may be completely upon your word and that which you would have us to understand. For this we thank you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so you wanted to bring up your timeline.
Yeah, I'm just going to bring this up here. I'm getting quite a bit of it sounds like somebody's vacuum cleaning in where you are. Not sure.
I'll turn off my microphone for a second. See if
well, it sounds good now, where you are now. I don't hear it at all. So even before you turn off the microphone. But when you were down there, it was, so, okay. So here's the line.
Okay.
And so what I have here is, you can see on the bottom, this is the whole line of the story of Esther, from Xerxes' accession, the Xerxes feast, the Persian campaign against Greece, Esther, her year, and then she's finally crowned at the end in the 10th month in the 7th year. And then we're getting to this period that we're in now. We're studying the 12th year of Xerxes. And what I did is I took these little dash lines just to expand this year out, because there's way too much stuff to put in that little 1 centimeter space. And so what we have here is April 5th, 474 BC commences Xerxes' 12th year. So that's the first day of the first month. And then you have that period of casting of lots. It doesn't give us the exact date that occurred, but the dates that were given, that they cast, we know from the first month to the 12th month, and that's what they ended up with, was this decree that was going to go into effect on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is March 7th, still in the 12th year of Xerxes. But at the beginning of that year, they cast lots, and they find that the 13th day of the 12th month is the correct time. The decree is given on the 13th day of the first month. Now, so in trying to look at that timeline there, we would say that Mordecai finds out about the decree. He tells Esther, then she begins this 3 days where they're going to fast night and day. And that 3 days ends. And what we didn't fully decide is how to lay out those 3 days. But my idea is that the third day, when it says the third day, we have to decide if that's the 19th or the 20th. So that's just a question that we have to resolve. And then banquet 1 and banquet 2 are going to follow. In between banquet 1 and banquet 2, Mordecai is honored. And after banquet 2, Haman is hanged, which we haven't got to yet. Right? So this is the period that we're studying. Now, if Haman's hanged on the 20th of April, which would be the 17th day of the first month, I guess, it'd be 66 days to Esther's decree on the 23rd day of the third month, which we haven't got to yet.
Would that be the 17th day or the 16th day?
Of
of the first month.
That's what I'm saying is we have to decide how long
Okay.
that is. So I think it would be, yeah, it's either the 16th or the 17th, and that's what we have to decide of the first month. But and if it was, I think this is when it's the 17th, the 16th, maybe it's when it's the 16th day. Anyway, the number of days I counted from Haman being hanged to the decree going into effect is 323 days. And Esther's decree is the third month, the 23rd day. So whether that's correct or not depends on how we take when Haman was hanged. But Esther's decree is on the 23rd of Sivan. And then you have the decree going into effect at the end there. So these are the things that we're going to look at a little bit as we go through. But I want this chart to be correct on how we decide through some of these things. So that's what I wanted to show you, what I'm working on. And once I get it done, I'll email it to everyone.
Okay. Take a look at the question in the chat real quick.
Okay, the question in the chat, would it be good to put 18720 on the 13th day, 12th month date? Yeah, we could. We can definitely do that. And that's because it's the 13th day of the 12th month in the 12th year. So if you multiply those together, you get 18720. Yeah, so I'll put those types of things on there. For now, it's just trying to get the dates and trying to figure out the spans of time.
Well, you would get 1872.
Yeah, 1872, correct. Not 18720. Yeah, but it's still the same idea. But yes, you're right.
Yep, same thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're going to put your stuff up?
Yep. So. Okay. Is that coming through okay?
Yep.
Okay, now, as we were going over Esther 5 this last week, we covered quite a bit of ground.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd like to go back over some things briefly just to see if we have questions or if we have any other observations from what we were addressing.
Well, the first thing would be the Esther 5:1. Now it came to pass on the third day. And did we decide what that third day was? What date it was?
Well, wouldn't that be the third day after Mordecai had recommended that they submit this in prayer and fast?
Right. But it's also called 3 days, right? Because they're going to fast 3 days, night and day.
Right.
And so just to clarify this for people, when you use an ordinal count like the third day, that we can call that in Bible 3 days. And when you take an ordinal count and you use a cardinal description, it's what we call inclusive reckoning, right?
Right.
So if you took the 13th as the first day and the 14th as the second day, then the 15th would be the third day. But when she says they're going to fast 3 days, or for 3 days, night and day, that would give most people the impression similar to the 3 days and 3 nights that Jonah's in the belly of the whale and Jesus is in the heart of the earth. People will take that and say that must be 72 hours.
Okay.
And so there is a discussion that goes on regarding this, where some people will say, well, when you say third day, that really means 72 hours. Now, I don't have any indication that that would be the case. We have the one expression, today, tomorrow, and the third day. And for all of the words.
But if we applied this more as a symbol of resurrection, then
yeah, that's where I'm taking it.
Yeah, I would bend more to that than I would to the direct, idea of 72 hours. Because it doesn't say that on the fourth day, it says on the third day. And so on the third day, she puts on this glorious apparel.
Right. And yeah. Okay, go on.
When we're dealing with that, the glorious apparel, if we apply this as a symbol, as we would with Christ, his glorious apparel was revealed when he came out of the tomb.
Yeah. And so we take the third day as an ordinal count, and I think that we should do that. But many people have taken the position that the third day is not referring to an ordinal count. That's the problem. Now, of course, we know Jesus was crucified on a Friday and resurrected on the Sunday. But I'm just trying to clarify this for some people who may be uncertain about this. Now, one verse that I use is Luke 13:32 to 33. And Jesus said unto them, go ye and tell that fox, referring to Herod, behold, I cast out devils and do cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. Nevertheless, I must walk today and tomorrow and the day following. For it cannot be that a prophet perish out of Jerusalem. Now, it's just the expression today, tomorrow, and the third day really suggests an ordinal count and not what we would call a 72-hour count. But still, some people will take this and not accept that. So when you do this what we call inclusive reckoning, when you call what we would call the third day and you call it 3 days, we also have some other expressions. The one is about 8 days. So this is about 8. I spelled it wrong. This is in Luke 9:28. And in this passage here, and it says, and it came to pass about 8 days after these sayings that he took Peter, James, and John and went up in the mount to pray. But when you look at the parallel verse in Mark 9, and it says, after 6 days, Jesus taketh with him Peter, James, and John. And Matthew says the same thing. And so people say, well, after 6 days, and then about 8 days after. And so I know it gets really confusing, but people will look at these things because Jesus will say, I will be resurrected after 3 days. And he also says on the third day. So he uses the expression after 3 days to mean the same thing as the third day. And the question is then, is the third day an ordinal count, or is it to be understood in some other way? And so we see the same thing in Esther. And I would argue that it's pretty straightforward that when you say third day, that is what we would normally think of as the third day. That's a normal ordinal count. But when you say 3 days, you're just expressing the ordinal count in an inclusive way. You're expressing it as a cardinal count, 3 whole days, but it doesn't mean 3 whole days. It's just an expression. So that's the position we take as Seventh-day Adventists. And I would say that we have to take the same position here in Esther, unless somebody has some other reason that we would.
Well, I'm looking at this as a type of resurrection.
Right.
Because she is no longer dressed in her sackcloth. And she's no longer there with ashes. It's now not a period of mourning. she knows she has a purpose. There's something that has to be done. And it's not saying on the fourth day.
Right.
It's not saying after the third day. It's saying on the third day.
Yeah. And so that means her fasting was really more what we would call 2 days.
Well,
right? Because she says she's going to fast for 3 days, night and day. But that's an inclusive count. It counts the part of the day that she starts on, the next day, and part of the day that she finishes on. She doesn't need 72 hours.
Okay, but if we looked at this in the same manner as we were addressing this with the crucifixion of the Savior.
Right, it's the same thing.
He was crucified on the preparation day, laid in the grave on the preparation day, was in the grave on the Sabbath, and was raised on the first day of the week.
Right.
So is that not the same in what we're seeing here with Esther?
And that's my point, is it's the same expression. and you also have the night and day. She doesn't say 3 days and 3 nights.
No.
But pretty much it amounts to the same thing. It's the same type of expression. Because if you're going to say, I'm not going to eat or drink for 3 days, night and day, a person listening to you nowadays would assume that that's going to be 72 hours.
Right.
They're not going to think that it's going to be, a little over 48 hours. And so we would assume that she began her fast on the 13th. At least that's what I'm assuming. And then on the 14th, she didn't, okay, how are we doing? So the 13th, and this would be at the evening. So it might have even been the 14th that she began technically, right? Because you have a lot of stuff happening in this day. You have the issuing of the decree. You have Mordecai mourning in the gates. This is noticed. One of Esther's maids or servants or whatever comes to him and asks why he's mourning. So you have this message going back and forth. So it's not a direct communication.
It's a chamberlain. Yeah.
Yeah, the Chamberlain, I guess it was, right?
Right.
So then finally she gives a message back to Mordecai that we're going to fast for 3 days, night and day. And so night is placed first. And so here's part of the problem. Are we including the 13th in this count as the 3 days? So the 13th would be the first day, the 14th would be the second day, and the 15th would be the third day. I would be more inclined to say it's the 14th, 15th, and 16th that are the 3 days, but that it's not at the end of the 16th day that she comes to present herself. It would be in the morning on the 16th day. She's not going to wait until that whole day is over.
Right.
That's the position that I take.
Well, this is why I'm looking at it that the situation is more like the trial, the crucifixion, and the laying in the grave.
Yeah, and even if you go back to when they prepare for the Passover, because when they prepare for the Passover, it's actually on the Thursday. So they're preparing for the Passover. He tells them to prepare, that you're going to go and find this upper room and everything's going to be provided. And then they have to slay the Passover lamb after sunset between the 2 evenings. That's during the time of twilight. And then they have to prepare this Passover lamb for the meal, right? So they slay the animal and they cook it. So they get everything ready and they get everything ready, and then they slay the animal right at sunset and cook it. And it takes a few hours for that lamb to cook, right? It doesn't cook in an hour. And then they have their meal. And then after their meal, Peter, James, and John and Jesus, go to the Mount of Olives. Jesus prays. And then when he comes from the Mount of Olives, then this crowd comes, and with Judas kissing him and all those things that happen, right? And then you have the trial of the night, which you're not supposed to have a trial in the nighttime. And then in the morning, you have the Pharisees. They don't want to go in to Pilate's house because they don't want to be defiled, because then they can't eat the Passover. And that's one of the reasons why many people take the position that the Passover meal that Jesus had with his disciples wasn't the Passover meal, that the Passover lamb was actually slain at the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th. This is the position the rabbinic Jews take. But if you look into the history, you see that mostly they took this position for political reasons long after the fact, and that it doesn't agree with the original Passover when they left Egypt. But be that as it may, we know that that whole period of time, I call it the 3 days and the 3 nights that Jesus is in the heart of the earth, is not the time that he's in the tomb. It's the time that he's in affliction. And that affliction actually begins when the Passover lamb is slain.
Okay, so in this situation, I'm going to borrow from a comment that was made on the chat.
Okay.
Do we apply Hosea 6, 2, and 3 to this?
Yes, that's another one that we can use. So, and it's one of my scripture songs. Come, let us return unto the Lord, for he hath torn and he will heal us. He hath smitten and he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us. And on the 3rd day, he will raise us up and we shall live in his sight. So again, that gives us that 3rd day for the resurrection. And that's exactly what we're talking about. And after 2 days doesn't necessarily mean 2 complete 24-hour periods. Right, that's part of the problem, is that we try to read into Hebrew expressions, even in the way that we often don't use it. Right, so somebody who argues that 3 days and 3 nights means 72 hours is really trying to read it. We often don't use it that way. We can say 3 days and 3 nights. It means part of a day, part of one of the days, and part of one of the nights at the end, or whatever. Right, so this is another good verse. So those are the ones I use: Hosea 6:2, the one in Luke 13:31, 32, and some other ones too. Also, I use Esther actually as an example of this. So when I'm discussing with people who believe in the Wednesday crucifixion, I bring up all these 3 verses.
Okay.
But the point is, I would think then, when you talk about the 3rd day, that is going to be the 16th, not the 15th.
So the other part of the comment was 16th day of the 1st month would make sense as first fruits and resurrection.
Yes, and that's, which, yeah, I forgot about that point. Yeah, and that's actually one of the main points here, is it actually perfectly parallels the Thursday to the Sunday in the biblical calendar in 31 AD when Jesus was crucified. So it gives us that account there. So now when we look at, because we read through Haman's plan to hang Mordecai, and then we're going to get in that in chapter 6, how we time Mordecai's hanging. So what else did you want to look at here? That was the thing I wanted to look at.
Well, I'm going to keep this open, as we go through this, because we're going to go fairly quick. But as we go through, let's look and see what we find as far as other figurative symbols that we may be able to apply in this situation. And because there were some symbols I looked at in Esther 6, and I'd like just to see if we find other symbols as we're going back through this on
one we see in is Esther 5:5, cause Haman to make haste. What is the hastening about? Does anybody remember what we dealt with making haste?
Well, let's go to that.
Because we never addressed that. But she says, cause Haman to make haste. What is the haste? Where do we find that in the story of, let's say, the story of the 3 days and 3 nights, the 3rd day, 1st and 3rd day, in the time of Christ? Because we've dealt with this hastening in this movement.
Well, because the Sabbath was drawing on, the Roman soldiers were instructed to break the legs of the three that were crucified.
How about what thou doest do quickly? Who said
right?
That? Okay. When you're speaking of that with Judas.
Yeah.
Okay. So Judas was sent. I mean, basically, Christ, reading his heart, sends him back to the priest to say, okay, make your arrangements now. And the disciples, thinking that he was going to go out to give some special offering, thought nothing further of it.
Yeah. And so we have this hastening. And I was trying to think of other places, but this showed up. Jeff used to talk about this quite a bit, the hastening, when people have to make haste. It shows up in lines in various places. So I can't think of them all right now. It's not something that, I've thought about for a long time. But anyway, it's an interesting point. So just little things like that, that's probably what you're talking about, right? That we missed out.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of these as we go through this that give us a bigger figurative representation that applies more for our time than it was in this particular story.
Yeah. And we also have the inquiry. That was another part of our lines. And of course, there's lots of questions here. Or the searching out of things. I'm going to go to, so this paper I was writing.
Right.
I addressed it in this paper, dealing with when they came out of Babylon. So this is in the story of Ezra. And we also have 3 days there, right? Because there's 3 days at the river Ahava, and they tarry there. That is, they abode in their tents 3 days. And I viewed the people.
Okay.
So the viewing is a type of examination. So there's a tarrying and examination. And this separation, all these three things occur in connection with 3 days. And we can go back to the 3 days with the butler and the baker. Because what happens to the baker after 3 days?
Bye-bye.
His head's going to be separated from off of him, something to that effect, right? So this idea, he's going to be discombobulated, literally. So you have these this 3 days. We use it as a symbol of the prediction before midnight, but it also contains within it a tarrying, an examination, and a separation. And this is Genesis 18, verse 7. What is that referring to?
Okay, but if we're going to be applying this, especially in make haste with Haman, should we also be applying Genesis 18:6?
Okay, I see what you're saying. So when we go to Genesis 18, verse 6, you have, and Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the earth. And Abraham ran unto the herd to fetch a calf tender and good, and gave it unto the young man, and he hasted to dress it. So there's a lot of hastening going on here, but also you have the number 3 in connection with that. So the 3 measures of fine meal. So I mean that's the thing, is it's almost never ending when it comes to examining these things that we're studying. I mean, we could really spend a lifetime going through some of these details, and they would keep bringing us back and forth through the Bible, connecting all of these stories and adding significance to each story.
I mean, as I'm looking further and considering what we could be talking about here, you've also got the situation from Genesis 24:20, and 27:20. But 27:20 is Jacob coming in with skins on his arms before his father to receive the blessing. So in a similar situation, here is Haman. He's come with a false purpose before the king.
Yeah.
So he's not telling the truth to the king. He's come with a hidden agenda.
Okay.
Because he wants to receive something. He wants to receive the right to put Mordecai to death.
You got in Ecclesiastes, be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. Be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry. Be not hasty to go out of his sight. Stand not in the evil thing. For he doeth whatsoever pleaseth him. And also, the Babylon's called a hasty nation.
Well,
and
we also have the situation where Joseph made haste, for his bowels did yearn upon his brother, and he sought where to weep. He entered into his chamber and wept there.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, and these hastenings, we've placed them on lines in different ways. We've done the same thing with, the inquiries and also separations, right? These are all things that exist. We have all these different symbols that exist within lines. And of course, you can't just take the symbol by itself. You have to place it within a line and see if it makes sense. But I'm just saying, within this context of these 3 days, we do have this haste that's described.
Well, here again, you also, in Exodus, you have the Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in haste.
Mm-hmm.
So in a situation here, you have Haman being called, but it's because Esther has invited the king and Haman to this feast.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of hastening all the way through Scripture.
Yes. But they are symbols.
Yeah.
And then when you put them within the structure themselves of the story, then it connects those individuals. Because if you're going to connect Haman to anyone in the story of Christ, it would be Judas.
It'd have to be.
Yeah. First off, they're both hanged.
Right.
Right. But also the deception that's going on. And the pride. And I mean, just everything. I mean, you wouldn't have a problem comparing Haman to Judas.
No.
But then,
go ahead.
Yeah, but this also helps us, because when we look at Xerxes, who is Xerxes then in the story?
I follow what you're saying, but I don't know that I understand the point yet.
Well, I would say that still Xerxes represents Christ.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, because he's the one that's betrayed. In a sense, he's the one that's being betrayed.
Right.
But then but we're looking at Esther and Mordecai as the messages, or the messengers.
Right.
Lining them up with the three angels' message. But of course, we're taking the line of Christ and we're taking the Millerite line and we're mixing them. But of course, we can mix them because they're the same line.
But I liked your point last week better, that this is the experience of the message.
Yeah, it's the experience. It represents the experience. But they're tied together, right? So the message and the experience of the message are tied.
No disagreement on my part.
Yeah. So, but we still have this point where in this story, just like Cyrus is a type of Christ, Xerxes is a type of Christ. Now, I had this discussion with somebody on YouTube. It's on, I think, my Friday night one from the week before. Where they're trying to argue that I couldn't use Manasseh as a type of Christ because Manasseh was a sinner and Jesus wasn't a sinner. And his argument is one of these arguments that we have run into with Esther as well. When we take somebody who's a bad person, but they typify Christ. And now my argument, of course, with Manasseh is he's the one who is the born to the virgin in the context of the prophecy within the 65 years. Jesus isn't born there. We make an application of it to Christ. That he's Emmanuel, God with us, and he's born of the Virgin Mary, which is correct. But that's because there is a type that happens, which is Manasseh. So Christ is the antitype of that. But Manasseh is converted, and he's a type of Christ in his conversion. That is, we're not using it as an example of his evil. We're using an example of the fact that he learned to choose the good and refuse the evil.
Right.
Which Christ did, right? Christ learned to do that. Now, of course, Christ was not a sinner and then came to learn to do that. But it's still a choice that he had to make as a human being. He had to constantly choose good and refuse evil. And of course, when it says, Ellen White says, his nature recoiled from evil, that wasn't his physical nature that recoiled. That was his mind, his spiritual nature, because Christ had two natures, like we also do. We have a physical nature which doesn't change at conversion, but we also have a spiritual nature if we're born of the Spirit. And so there was this misunderstanding, one, of righteousness by faith and the nature of Christ that he presents. But also it's a failure to understand what a type is. And so we know that Cyrus is a type of Christ. And so to make Xerxes as a type of Christ is completely, it's in accordance with the scriptures. But we also are making an application to our time as well, right? So we're making a much more present truth application of that. But in this story, if you're just going to look at it, not outside of this message, anybody reading this story would have to see that Xerxes is typifying Christ. If they're going to compare these dates with the time of Christ, it's the same dates, starting on the 13th day, going all the way to the 16th day. And the parallels are unmistakable.
Okay. So anything else that we're seeing that we should be and could have looked at this last week? I mean, one comment is, here is Esther. She fainted. And there are those that have tried to say that Christ didn't really die, that he just passed out from the strain. And Christ died.
Yeah, that would be the one group that doesn't teaches that Christ didn't die is Islam.
Right. So, but there's just so much that's here in this story in Esther. So,
yeah. Okay. Well, the other thing is you have Haman plans to hang Mordecai. Now, of course, Judas betrays Christ.
Right.
Now we're saying here that Xerxes typifies Christ in this story, and that Mordecai and Esther represent Mordecai, the second angel's message, and the experience of it, and Esther, the third angel's message and the experience of it. But when Haman is planning to hang Mordecai, how would we parallel that with Judas? Would we take that Mordecai represents Christ here, or that this is something else?
Well, I was applying Mordecai as more as the fourth angel's message, but the experience of both the second and the fourth angel.
Yeah, because the fourth is the second. So if we applied it there, just to interrupt you, so if we applied it there, then we would see that this is referring to the fourth angel arriving is after the third angel. So Mordecai, and this would align up with the repeat of history. So just as Haman originally was trying to overthrow, and we're making this implication that this plot to overthrow or to do something against Xerxes was actually partly Haman's plan.
Right.
And when Mordecai uncovered that, that's one of the reasons that Haman sought to kill Mordecai.
Right.
But we could then also say that Haman now is planning to hurt Mordecai, just because his connection with Christ, in a sense, like
right.
God's people. Yeah. So the persecution that happens to God's people at the end of time, when the 144,000 say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And the very words that came from Christ's lips on the cross comes from their lips. That's Christ in his people, showing that they have the experience and the character of Christ. And Mordecai has that character as well.
Okay. So I guess I'm kind of focused also on this part of it with, the situation of Pharaoh against Moses and Aaron. Because Aaron was the one that was delivering a message. But Moses was seen more as being the front man, right?
Yeah.
So in one way of looking at it, here's Haman, who is denying God, but yet he is having to admit that all of his advisors and all of those that he has under his power cannot gainsay anything that Moses or Aaron has had to say.
Mm-hmm.
And here's Haman. Through deception and subtlety, he goes into the king. He doesn't want to tell the king the truth. He doesn't want to reveal his entire intent. He just wants to say, these people are not obeying your laws. So, and that's something I've got to give it, I have to place some more thought on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, there's a bunch of other things too. You have a bunch of different symbols that, we've addressed a little bit. Mordecai sitting in the gates and these banquets, so we would look at other banquets in the Bible and make comparisons, and of course a banquet where I will give you whatever you require or ask, even to half the kingdom, those types of things. And that's one of the things I was reading, where she makes this request, right?
Right.
My petition and my request. So this is at the banquet of wine. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare of them, right? And you're going to have this happen again. She's going to make another request. I believe, which is the, how many requests, how many times does that happen? I'm going to just look this up.
Well, I'm looking up the word right now. It's interesting that word is used 14 times.
Which word? Request?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's translated as request or petition primarily. And in some places, it's translated as loan.
Yeah. Yeah, and we haven't got there yet, but when we get to Esther chapter 7, on the second day at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee, what is thy request? It shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Some commentators say that basically he gave her half the kingdom, that it wasn't, that there is in the language, not, it's not just rhetorical, but actually that he gives her the half the kingdom. Now I'm not sure if I understand it fully why they say that, but they say it's in the language itself.
But if they're making, in a situation like that,
yeah,
that would mean that Esther was co-regent with Xerxes.
Yes. Yeah, she becomes co-regent. And this is why, you know, and I was reading this in connection with arguments for the historical veracity of the Book of Esther. And I think it was actually William Shea's article on it. So I don't agree with everything he says about some of the chronology and some of his reasoning, but it's pretty good where he gives the evidence for the Book of Esther. And so one of the things is Amestrius, and I don't think it's him, I think it's somebody else who actually shows how that is Esther. Because that's the name that was given to the king by the Greek writers. And you can actually show how morphologically the name, as it changes through transliteration, would go to Hebrew Esther to be Amestrius in Greek from a Persian original. So they don't look the same, but they are the same name. And then the other thing is just and I think it's Shea who talks about, of course, that when he gets this request, it's in the language of this request that she does become co-ruler in it with Xerxes, and that would line up with Amestris as well. So she was actually honored above any queen in Persia in various ways. There's because usually queens wouldn't be depicted in statues or things like that, or in bas reliefs, and she is. So there's just a lot of things like that. And I was also reading Gerhard Gertot, so he makes cases for the historicity of the Book of Esther. So there's just a lot of things here that if we accept that this is true history, as we do, there's some pretty interesting things that we can learn by comparing it with the stories of history, even though they have faults with them. And it can give us an understanding of the Book of Esther, what's being done here. So the question, though, if Esther is being given half the kingdom, what does that mean as a symbol prophetically? You know, if we just look at some other Bible verses. Anybody know what I'm talking about?
I know that there must be, but I'm not bringing any to mind at this moment. I was looking at this almost as a co-regency, because they speak of the 144,000 as reigning as priests and kings with Christ.
Yeah, and we have Romans 8:17, which backwards is July 18th. And if children, then heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. If so be that we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. So this idea that we become joint heirs, I think, is depicted in this story as well.
Right. Becomes interesting. Now, there's another comment on the chat. We haven't really gotten back into scepter yet, but there's a comment on the chat dealing with scepters that potentially could symbolize righteousness.
Yeah, the scepter of righteousness is the scepter of thy kingdom. The scepter of thy kingdom is a right scepter, and also the scepter of Christ, Genesis 49:10 and Numbers 24:17.
So
now the scepter, of course, is used in 49:10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. So this is the scepter of Christ as well. And then in Numbers 24:17, you have, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. This is Balaam speaking, right? There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab and destroy all the children of Seth, or Sheth. And we haven't even really studied it. That's one thing we need to go back and do as a study is Balaam. But anyway, that's an aside. But yeah, so this scepter, she touches his scepter, and that he holds it out to her, and she touches it, and she's accepted. So it's a sign of this acceptance in that story.
So another question on the chat was, is giving half the kingdom a representation of separation of church and state? Literal or figurative?
Well, the thing is, Christ's bride, Christ is the king, and his bride, we're joint heirs with Christ, but the woman represents a church. So Christ marries his church. And I always think of the first example of the separation of church and state is the creation of Adam and Eve.
Right.
So I would say yes, that it does symbolize it.
Okay. Okay. So as we look to go forward, then went Haman forth that day joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. So this is the evening between, shall we say, the third and the fourth day on the timeline?
Right. So the third day happened. They had the first banquet. And so that first banquet, we said, is on the 16th.
Right.
Right. And then he sort of complains about this. And then the next day, he's going to go to Xerxes, and he's going to, and Xerxes is going to tell, because Xerxes is going to have a dream as well.
Okay.
Right. So we haven't got there yet. But anyway, just to place this on the timeline, we would say this is the night of the 16th. So the next day will be the 17th.
Okay. So
I think that's what we're saying.
Okay. So here we are, Esther 5:10. And he sends for his friends. So he's bringing in people. He wants people gathered around him to celebrate with him, basically. Would you agree with that? Or is he asking them to come to give him advice?
I think he's looking for advice.
Okay. So Haman refrains himself when he came home. He sent and called for his friends and Zeresh, his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches. So he's telling them all about his, basically showing his ego. He's not saying much about the king. He's not saying much about Queen Esther. He's just saying, hey, I'm rich. I have lots of children. And then he comes in and says, here's where the king has promoted me. and how I've been advanced. So look at me. I'm better than everybody else. Is that not the same spirit that the adversary had, and that's described elsewhere in Scripture, how he's so lifted up? So could we say that Haman is showing not just his character, but also the character of the adversary?
Mm-hmm.
So, yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So, the adversary has control of the entire world except for a little band that seeks to honor God's law.
Well, God always has 7,000 in Israel that have not bowed the knee unto Baal.
Right.
And those are which Satan is the most angry with.
So,
but that's the nature of somebody of a narcissist. They're never happy or satisfied with what they have. They always think about what they don't have.
Right. So what's the symbolism of the gallows? What do we deal with here? I mean, this word that's speaking of gallows is also in other places translated as tree. Right?
Yes. So this word, just trying to understand it, because you have to look at really what the word is and why it's translated certain ways. Because this is basically, it's a tree that's being prepared, right?
Okay.
So this is just the word etz. So we talked about that. And the word etz has a lot of symbolism because a tree is a very symbolic idea, right? So literally you have it here translated as tree. Now, what kind of verses were you thinking of that?
Cursed is the man that is hung upon a tree.
Right. So that's again the tree, and that symbolizes the cross. It's also translated wood, gallows, sticks. Carpenters come from that word. Planks, stocks, sticks. But yeah, cursed is the one that hangs on a tree, and we know that Christ, he was made a curse for us, and so he's hanged on a tree. And a symbol really of sun worship. We also had Absalom got hung on a tree. And the other one was, well, Judas hanged himself, and that was on a tree. So okay. The one thing that you have is and the other thing is the contrast between Mordecai being honored and Haman being hanged. So you have that contrast as well.
Okay, so supporting what we had just been talking about in the chat, we have Testimonies for the Church, 5th Testimonies, page 450. And the comment there is, the Protestant world today see in the little company keeping the Sabbath a Mordecai in the gate. His character and conduct, expressing reverence for the law of God, are a constant rebuke to those who have cast off the fear of the Lord and are trampling upon his Sabbath. The unwelcome intruder must by some means be put out of the way. But one of the other comments that came back about the symbolism of the 50 cubits is that the National Sunday Law will have to include all 50 states.
Oh, that's an interesting idea.
Okay. And then that the butler and baker's fates in Joseph's time are contrasted.
Yeah.
So
again, yeah, same idea. And dealing with 3 days. And,
okay. And then another one that's just been posted, kingdom, Luke 12:32. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. James 2:5. Hearken, my beloved brethren, hath not God chosen the poor of this world rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he hath promised to them that love him? So it's interesting. I mean, I was looking at the different numeric symbols on that 50 cubits, and the point of this having to be 50 states for a national Sunday law gives even a deeper symbol overall. So
yeah, and of course the whole purpose of this, with the last quote, I mean, is about preparing a people that are going to stand for God based upon faith, right? So they're trusting in God in spite of what they see. And that's the 144,000 who have the experience of Christ. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So we haven't read the part of chapter 6 yet, right? So this is where we're going next.
Okay. So let's do a brief overview on 6 because we've got about 30 minutes remaining.
Yeah.
So I'm going to close this window and then come back to 6. Okay. Okay. Does that come up okay?
Yeah.
All right. So Ahasuerus, hearing read in the Chronicles the good service done by Mordecai, thinketh how to reward him. Verse 4, Haman, coming to sue that Mordecai might be hanged, becometh himself the instrument of doing him honor. And in verse 12, complaining of his misfortune, his friends foretell of his fall. This is one of those chapters in Esther that does not have anything from the Apocrypha.
Mm-hmm.
So, on that night, could not the kings sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of Chronicles, that they were read before the king. And the Hebrew alternate is that on that night the king's sleep fled away. And he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. Now, the thing is here, Bigthana and Bigthan are actually the same person. This is not an alternate, a third chamberlain. It's still the same 2. And the translators use as a reference on that to Esther 2:21. In those days when Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, What honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? And then the king's servants that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. And the king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house. We were talking about this last week as well. To speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servants said unto him, Behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So in other words, the outer court was separate from the king's court.
Yeah.
So we know that there is an outer court, an inner court, but you're going to have several doorways that you're going to have to go through. You have to get through different servants and cross different thresholds to come in. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Or in the Hebrew, in whose honor the king delighteth. Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? What would we say about Haman with that kind of a thought? Self-absorbed is what comes to mind.
Yeah. Yeah, he's just thinking he's going to get honored, obviously. So.
And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought, which the king used to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. Now, when I was looking at this verse, this specific verse, if this is being used in looking at our time right now, how would the symbol of apparel, the horse, and the crown be applied?
Well, apparel represents the character.
Okay, so could Haman be clothed in a different character?
No. God never puts his robe of righteousness upon a garment of filthy rags. They have to be removed.
Okay. So, looking at that, what would we say about a horse? How would Father Miller have looked at a horse?
Well, it's to give a message. It's a way to send a message.
Well,
you ride a horse to travel to give the message. And you see the horse used in Zechariah. It refers to the messages that go out, that are being sent out.
How about Jeremiah 8:6?
I hearkened and heard, but they spake not aright. No man repented of his wickedness, saying, what have I done? Everyone turneth to his course, as the horse rusheth to battle. So they'd be used for battle as well.
Right. Proverbs 21:31.
The horse is prepared against the day of battle, but safety is of the Lord.
So we have a battle that's going on here. This is a battle between the power of God and the power of the adversary. And Haman cannot be clothed in the apparel of a king, because that's not the point that the king is trying to make here. But there is a battle. But we also have this crown that's to be set upon the head of the one that the king wishes to honor. So when I looked at this in symbol, is this not a representation of those that come through victorious through the giving of the messages of Revelation 14 and 18?
Mm-hmm.
Another point that was being brought up, that it could symbolize Christ in the pure early church of Revelation 6, white horse and royal, the conqueror Christ in his church triumphant in Revelation 19.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other symbolic representations that we can apply here? I mean, Haman is not going to represent Lazarus. Lazarus, the one that was dead, led the foal of the ass with Christ riding upon that foal into Jerusalem. But Haman is given charge that he is now to lead the king's horse, the king's war horse, with Mordecai in the king's apparel, wearing the king's crown throughout Shushan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shushan is not Babylon. It is a capital city of the Medes and Persians. So this message, as it's lifted up, is going into the capital city of a two-horned power.
This would be the U.S. then.
Right. But that message is not one that Haman wants to give. But yet he's there, and he as this proceeds. So in the alternate Hebrew, let them bring the royal apparel, wherewith the king clothed himself, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delight to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Then the king said to Haman, make haste, here's another haste, and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. But the Hebrew says, suffer not a whit to fall.
Okay.
So do it exactly. Don't leave anything out. So okay, let's see. Haman wants to be honored as in having the position and respect of the king, but does not have the character. Satan said in his heart, I will be like the Most High. Isaiah 14:14. That's an excellent point. So Haman doesn't have the character. Mordecai has the character but it's not been publicly addressed in that way. He's done what he's had to do to protect his king. He's done what he's had to do to show that he honors the law both of God and of man. John 12:26 or Romans 2:7. Any thoughts in applying it in this way? So let's see, John 12:26. John 12:26 reads, if any man serve me, let him follow me, and where I am, there shall also my servant be. If any man serve me, him will my Father honor.
And Romans 2:7, to them who by patient continuance in well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, eternal life. I mean, so we don't seek, glory and honor in and of itself. There's character that goes along with it. You can't have glory and honor correctly if you don't have a Christ-like character.
Right. If we're not preparing, if we're not accepting what Christ has been providing, then that character is never going to be developed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in this situation, we're seeing that Haman has been told twice, once in chapter 5, once in chapter 6, that he must make haste. Mm-hmm. Once he's told to make haste by the chamberlains, and once he's told to make haste by the king himself. Is there anything in that we can apply figuratively?
Well, the haste, as sort of pointed out before, we are not to be hasty in the sense of character.
Right.
We need patience. Patience is kind of the opposite, I guess, in a certain sense, of hastiness. And if you look at this thing, the fact that he jumped to this conclusion that he was the one that was going to be honored, I mean, it shows his character, that he's not really thinking it through. He's not being patient, thoughtful in his actions, and it ends up causing him dishonor, but he doesn't realize that his dishonor is the result of his own character.
Right.
And that's why in verse 12, Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house mourning and having his head covered. So his haste caused him mourning.
In a way, could we say that he ran away from this situation? He wanted to get home because he was so embarrassed of having to honor Mordecai.
Yeah.
Are there other symbols that we could address in this portion? Okay. Haman's abasement before Mordecai compared with Revelation 3:9. Behold, I will make of the synagogue of Satan, which they are Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them to come and worship before thy feet, and to know that I have loved thee.
Verse 10, because thou hast kept the word of my patience, I will also keep thee from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon all the world, to try them that dwell on the earth. And of course, this is in the message to the Church of Philadelphia, which Ellen White attributes to that period of time from 1840 to 44, or somewhere in there.
Right.
It's the message of the church that has, I said before thee, an open door, no man can shut it. Right. So it refers back to Isaiah 22:22, the key of David and all that. So we've addressed this. And if you think about it too, if you look at this whole message to the Church of Philadelphia, to the angel of the Church of Philadelphia write, these things saith he that is holy, he that is true, he that hath the key of David, he that openeth and no man shutteth, and shutteth and no man openeth. I know thy works, behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it. For thou hast a little strength, and hast kept my word, and hast not denied my name. So you set this character of where the open door is, that's set before God's people. And it's all because of their patience. Now then you do have a haste that comes in verse 11. Behold, I come quickly. Hold fast which thou hast, that no man take thy crown. I mean, that's an encouragement that even though it appears that Christ is delayed his coming, he says, I come quickly. And obviously it doesn't seem that quick to us. But in the context of somebody who's patient, that's where that expression has meaning. Right? Because if you're just impatient, you're not going to hold fast. And it says that no man take thy crown, right? So that crown is mentioned again in this context. So the honor that Mordecai receives is a type of the honor that we receive for patience. And Haman typifies those that are hasty and anxious and impatient and don't have Christ's character. They can't hold fast, which God has given them.
Okay. Now we have a few minutes. We haven't completely gotten through chapter 6. We have a few minutes remaining. Any other thoughts at this point?
Well, the thing that I'm still interested is dealing with the chronology of this that's going to come. So, and it's kind of weird that verse 14 is in chapter 6 and not in chapter 7.
Right.
But it's just, I think it connects it because he's having this meeting, and while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. But at least the title, Esther reveals the plot, sort of. But you kind of have to look at it together. It's almost the chapter divisions don't really make much sense there. They could have put it in the same chapter.
True, but I mean, I think there's a reason for seeing it in chapter 6, because it gives a closure at this point. It basically gives kind of a dividing line. Yeah,
of that story. So it's connecting chapter 6 to chapter 7.
Right.
Right. So while they were yet talking with him, came the king chamberlains. Right. They hastened him to the banquet. And then in chapter 7, verse 1, so the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. Mm-hmm. So now you're going to have this second banquet. So as far as the timeline of this, would we say that this, when he honors Mordecai, that this is the next day? Because it hasn't really.
It has to be the next day.
Yeah. It doesn't say it's the next day, but it would have to be the next day. Based on the timeline of how the story has gone.
Well, based also upon the verbiage that's used, because if you're going to honor somebody, are you going to take them out and honor them in the middle of the night?
No, it would be the next morning.
It would be when the business of the city is in full swing.
Yeah.
So I can give on the point that this would have been on the 16th day of the first month.
Yeah, and yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, okay, so because you had the nighttime, what we have is the nighttime where the king couldn't sleep. And so it's the next morning that Haman comes to him, and then the king sends him out. Right? So chapter 6, right. Verse 1 gives us that it's the next day. But that's the way that I would look at it. It's just the next day after the banquet of wine, the first banquet of wine.
Okay. Another comment in the chat. Just a thought of the parallel to Haman's design. At the persecution of the Sunday law, God's people will be brought to notice before the courts to answer for their faith. But God uses it for good to spread the messages of the three angels to the world.
Yeah, so he's being lifted up as an ensign.
Right. It's another way of saying it. Correct. Mm-hmm. So here is, are we now saying that Haman has been hastened 3 times? Twice by chamberlains and once by the king.
Okay. Yeah. Now, so just dealing with the chronology of this. So we had on the 13th, they give this decree.
Correct.
The 14th and the 15th, Esther is
Esther and Mordecai are both praying in sackcloth and ashes.
Right. And then on the 16th, she goes to Xerxes and they have that first banquet.
Change of apparel and the first banquet. Yes.
Yeah. And then that night, the king can't sleep and he looks up the book of records of the Chronicles.
Right.
Right. And so in the morning, Haman's going to the king because he wants to hang Mordecai on the gallows. But right. Of course, he doesn't press that issue because God is saying, I'm going to have you honor Mordecai, right? So, right. I mean, if the king hadn't had this dream, then Haman would have gone to the king and, had his story and Mordecai would have been hanged. But in this case, the king has a dream. And this reminds me of other kings with dreams, but I'm not going to go into all that now, but, who can't sleep and they look at things. And in this case, we see that Mordecai is going to be honored. So that actually detracts Haman from his purpose. So how is he going to hang Mordecai now that the king wants him to be honored? Obviously, he can't even bring his request to the king in that context. It definitely would fall on dead ears.
Right.
Right. So things are kind of turning bad for Haman.
I know.
But for Haman, they're turning bad. And this is...
I just said kind of turning bad?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. I just tend to understate things. So, but this is the 17th.
Right.
Okay, so this is the 17th day of the first month. And then we have chapter 7 that banquet then is on the 17th. The second banquet. It's just the next day. So they had a banquet on the 16th, and then they have a banquet on the 17th.
So another question was on the books of record, does this not parallel the books of lives record, as in a type of investigative judgment.
Yeah. Yeah, we would definitely make that parallel.
Okay. Okay. It is.
So, yeah, so that's where we're going to stop. We're moving into chapter 7 next time.
Okay. But I'm going to challenge you all to look at this more from a symbolic rather than just a literal reading, and let's see what other symbols we do come up with.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to work on that chart, and before we get together next time, I'm going to try to get it ready so that it's nice and organized, and the dates, at least to that point, are correct.
Okay. So shall we close with prayer?
Yeah.
Okay. Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you for the many things that we have addressed today. We thank you for the many examples that you have provided through your word. Help us now as we go through the balance of this day. Help us to think on these examples. Help us to consider, to take in these examples, and to more properly represent you in all that we say and that we do through this day and in all that you would have us to do. Be with us now. Direct us. May our steps follow the path that you would set before us. For this we thank you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.